We don't want your GMOs. If you're proud of what you make, then label it. No, Monsanto, we don't want your GMOs. If you're proud of what you make, then label it. No, Monsanto.
And next we have Joan Russow. She is the former Green Party leader. And as the former leader of the Green Party, Joan ran in the 1997 and 2000 federal elections calling for the banning of genetically engineered food and crops. In 1998, she attended the Biodevastation Conference in St. Louis, the heart of Monsanto land, and drafted the Biodevastation Declaration 1. And in 1999, at Vandana Shiva's Biodevastation 2 conference in Delhi, India, Joan drafted a resolution calling for a global ban on GE food and crops. Currently, at the international level, Joan has circulated a petition with Nigerian Nemo Bassi and continuing to call for a global ban. I'm very honored to welcome Joan Russow here today.
And if nothing is done soon, there may no longer be organic food and crops. The situation is urgent. GMOs and non-GMOs cannot coexist. We are living in a wake of institutional collusion among universities, regulatory agencies, industries, governments, and journals, all of which collectively contribute to gross or criminal negligence resulting in global food insecurity and a lack of food sovereignty. Genetically engineered food and crops should have been banned years ago. While labeling is important, it addresses the right to know, but labeling does not address the equity issue. Not everyone everywhere can afford to buy organic food. And labeling does not address the environmental issue, genetic drift and genetic contamination. These are urgent issues, and given the long-standing scientific evidence of potential harm of genetically engineered food, it is incumbent upon the global community to demand the invoking of the precautionary principle, which reads, where there is a threat to the environment, the threat of loss or of biodiversity or a threat to human health, the lack of full scientific certainty of harm should not be used as a reason to postpone measures to prevent the threat. Now, one of the problems in Canada is Canada has reversed that. I read here that we don't have to wait until there's scientific certainty of harm. But what Canada has done is we don't have to wait till there's scientific certainty of safety, and they end up proceeding. They only look at what they want to look at. They don't look at the ones that have been giving information about harm over the years. In Canada, the version has resulted in questionable approval of genetically engineered foods and crops. The interpretation is diametrically opposed to the international precautionary principle and has resulted in justifying the avoidance of all independent research, such as studies carried over a longer period of time than the requirement of 90 days. This is what Monsanto does, only test for 90 days, and that's what the requirement is. But when a study was done by Seralina over a 2-year period, there were devastating outcomes. There has, however, been sufficient scientific evidence of harm by independent researchers to justify invoking the international precautionary principle and for demanding not only a ban in Canada, but also a global ban. I have a little scroll here of some things I think we might try to do at the international level. To call for a global ban of genetically engineered food and crops and their associated pesticides, such as Roundup. We've got to include calling for the banning of Roundup. To call for the removal from stores of foods derived from the process of genetic engineering. This is something we could do, go into stores and talk about removing it from the shelves. And to build on the following United Nations precedent, which is really important. In 2000, the United Nations called for a moratorium on genetically modified to render seeds sterile. That's called GERT. and it's affectionately known as the Terminator gene. Have you heard of the Terminator gene? Yeah. Well, the U.S. was calling for a moratorium, and even Monsanto said that they would respect the moratorium, but they wouldn't rule out the possibility of doing it in the future. So that's why it has to be called, we have to call for a ban. To call upon the UN General Assembly to draft a declaration instituting a global ban on genetically engineered foods and crops and a global ban on the patenting of life forms. And to call for the UN General Assembly to invoke Article 22, which they can, and set up an international tribunal to try the pro-GMO regulatory agencies and Monsanto and its GMO cohorts for causing gross criminal negligence and for causing irreversible global food insecurity and for causing loss of food sovereignty. To call for non-GMO producing country governments to take the GMO producing country governments to the International Court of Justice for violating the objective of the legally binding Convention on Biological Diversity. And to call for the World Health Organization's Codex Alimentarius, which permitted GMO labeling in 2011 to support the banning of GMOs, so countries wishing to ban GMOs would not be vulnerable to attacks under the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And to call upon the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, to support the global ban. The Secretary General of the FAO has said, we don't need GMOs, we don't know what will happen to areas of production and the crops, and said that to eliminate malnutrition and food insecurity, small producers have to be at the center of policy and given assistance and support. Actually, I was at the UN and I criticized Bill Gates. Bill Gates is spreading GMOs all around the world, particularly in Africa, and I tried to embarrass him internationally. To call for global support program for promoting organic agriculture and other forms of ecological farming, and for instituting a fair and just transition program for farmers and communities affected by the ban. Because there are many farmers that have bought into it, and they should be encouraged to convert, and we've got to support them as well. And to call for global protection of small farmers and guarantee global food sovereignty. La Via Campesina defined, La Via Campesina is a global movement of farmers, and they define food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriated food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Food sovereignty calls for a fundamental shift in focus from food as a commodity to food as a public good. As such, it can once again assume its central role in strengthening communities and ecosystems and economies. Also, food sovereignty emphasizes that people must have a say in how their food is produced, where it comes from. The core of food sovereignty is reclaiming public decision-making power over the food system. To call for the Canadian BC governments to implement the GE-free resolution passed at the Union of BC Municipalities on September 19. That UBCM asked the British Columbian government to legislate the prohibition of importing, exporting, and growing plants and seeds containing genetically engineered DNA, and of raising GE animals within BC, and to declare through legislation that BC is a GE-free area in respect to all plant and animal species. Also, it is important to maintain agricultural land, and also to call upon the BC government to not proceed with a Site C dam, which will destroy acres and acres of good agricultural land. And to call on the BC government to rescind Bill 23 on the Agricultural Land Reserve, and to increase instead of decrease the size of the ALR. Food security requires a land and water base that must take priority over industrial development. So ban GMOs now. Ban GMOs now. Thanks.